Okay, welcome to lesson 26. This is the last lesson in this unit, and actually the last lesson of the course. So in this lesson we're going to talk about developing the parts of your essay, your research essay, essay 4. So we have 4 objectives here. First, we're going to review how to develop counterarguments and how to develop reasons. We're also going to review how to develop conclusions. And then we're going to review a full-length sample of the essay. And we're going to wrap up essay 4. So after this lesson, I want you to finish your essay 4 draft. It should be about 4 to 5 pages, and plus you want a reference page at the end. Do the best you can with it, and email me your first draft at brooks.winchell@cambridgecollege.edu, and I'll take a look at it and I'll get back to you soon. And I might have you do a final draft of that, time depending. But try to email that to me as soon as possible, and that's the last assignment for the class. So let's just review real quickly. In lesson 24, I talked about creating an outline for your essay and how to do that effectively. Then in lesson 25, I talked about developing an introduction for your essay. And we talked about the different steps in creating an introduction, or different modes of introducing, using definitions, history, statistics, and laws. And so hopefully everybody came up with a nice introduction and outline and got to email them to me and got some feedback. And so you feel pretty good about how you're going to move into this essay. So in this last essay, I'm going to talk about how you develop the rest of your essay 4. We're going to look at several different samples. So your entire essay is going to be made up mostly of reasons and counterarguments, depending on what your thesis is. If you have a moderated thesis, you're mostly just going to have reasons, kind of reasons for and reasons against. But if you have a stronger thesis, you'll probably have some counter-arguments, things that go against your ideas that you might not necessarily accept. And depending upon whether you have reasons or counter-arguments, you want to handle them differently. Typically, it's best to put counter-arguments first, like we talked about with essay 1. So if you have counter-arguments in your essay, try to introduce those early in your essay. And those are things that disagree with you. And you want to handle those, and we'll talk about those in a second. Then, after you put in your counter-arguments, you want to move into your reasons. And your reasons should be your strongest points in the essay. That's where you're going to get the reader to believe you, see your point. And all your reasons should be backed with some kind of evidence. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. So, counter-arguments. So whenever you include a counter-argument, which I think we all remember is an argument that disagrees with your argument, whenever you bring one of those into your essay, and you should, because it's always good to introduce other people's ideas, you want to make sure that you handle them, right? And you can handle a counter-argument in one of 3 ways. So you can either accept the counter-argument and say, this person says something that I don't necessarily agree with, and I accept that as a valid point. However, I think I have stronger points. You can refute it with evidence and say, this counter-argument disagrees with what I'm saying. It's actually completely wrong because the evidence says the opposite, and give that opposite evidence. Finally, you could refute it with a critique. So not necessarily giving evidence that shows the opposite, but critiquing the position. And so for instance, if you have a counter-argument that presents research, you could critique the research study or critique the researchers and sort of disprove the counter-argument that way. But anytime you bring a counter-argument in, you want to handle it in one of 3 ways. So let's actually take a look at these 3 different ways of handling counter-arguments in an example. So here's some examples of some counter-arguments. So as we said, there's 3 ways you can handle the counter-arguments. I have my pen on here. So the first way you can handle the counter-argument is by accepting it. So let's take a look at somebody who accepts a counter-argument. So it says, despite the costly procedure and time-consuming process, some still claim that teacher tenure is the best way to protect teachers from discrimination. We know this is a counter-argument because the author leads off with some still claim, which shows that this isn't her idea. So some still claim that teacher tenure is the best way to protect teachers from discrimination. Throughout the late 1800s, teachers were dismissed for not only non-work-related reasons, but were also dismissed for political reasons as well. In his article released by the United Federation of Teachers, Michael Hirsch, 2012, tells the story of an untenured teacher by the name of Lisa Capice, who was fired in 2008 after becoming the target of a principal's abuse, harassment, discrimination, and disciplinary actions. She was dismissed after asking the principal for compensatory time or pay for prep time that teachers lost while proctoring state exams. On February 10, 2008, the Supreme Court found that Lisa Caprice was unfairly fired and ordered that she be rehired with pay, interest, tenure, and seniority. Without the protection of teacher tenure, Lisa Caprice was an easy target for the principal's unethical behavior. So here's an argument that goes against this person's idea, which is her reason is that there's problems with teacher tenure. But here's an argument that says teacher tenure can be a good thing, and Hirsch gives us this example of how teacher tenure helped this woman, Lisa Caprice, to keep her job. So this person doesn't refute the counterargument. Instead, she says, this is a good point. However, the issues with tenure outweigh the benefits. So she's just accepting it and saying, that's a good point, but there are some other issues that we should consider. Here's another set of counterarguments. And in this one, there's actually a couple of paragraphs of counterarguments. The author refutes several different counterarguments and gives evidence in her refutes. And so this one was about rap music. And she says in her thesis is that, rap music isn't that bad, or, we shouldn't be completely against rap music because there is some positive. And so here in a counterargument, she's talking about criticisms of rap music. And she says, one of the largest criticisms of hip-hop is that the lyrics are often negative, explicit, and contain themes of violence. However, and here she's sort of refuting it, the RIAA, Recording Industry Association, has implemented a voluntary program where record companies can identify and label newly released sound recordings that may contain strong language or expressions of violence, sex, or substance abuse. This program allows parents and other consumers to easily recognize a song or other piece of work that may be unsuitable for themselves or for children. So here she brings in a counterargument and she refutes it and says that's not true. Additionally, many record companies also release clean versions of their songs for consumers. Therefore, one should not argue that children are easily swayed by these suggestive lyrics because it's basically up to the parents of what their children may listen to. If a parent is going to allow their children to listen to vulgar lyrics, they may run the risk of their child being influenced by those lyrics. One would be naive to say these songs are not marked or labeled. So she's just kind of reinforcing her point that it's basically the parents' fault if kids get music with explicit lyrics. Here's another counterargument. Also, many argue that because of explicit content and freedom of speech, women are often depicted as sexual objects and having no self-worth. Additionally, according to Encyclopedia of Race, Ethnicity, and Society, these images of women create gaps for females trying to make it big in the hip-hop industry. So here's actually, she cites a source here, Fitz, who says that hip-hop might sexualize women and prevent them from making it big in the hip-hop industry. And she refutes that as well. She says, however, even though there are some lyrics that are derogatory towards women, the existence of a strong female presence in hip-hop that displays diverse images of self-defined black female sexuality is part of a larger social discourse on breaking down institutional and psychological systems of oppression and eliminating barriers to black female visibility and collectivity. So here, she actually uses Fitz again because Fitz helps to refute that. She's refuting the idea that hip-hop degrades women and saying, actually, some hip-hop actually empowers women and black female sexuality. So that's an interesting refute to the argument. So here's a good example of refuting a counterargument with evidence. Let's take a look at the last one. In addition to refuting it with evidence, you can also refute an argument with criticism or critical thinking. And that's what we did in Essay 3, was we applied some critical thinking to evaluate arguments. So you can think critically about an argument and point out some of the problems with it. And that's exactly what this person does here. She says, many people when attacking child beauty pageants try to use studies to support their claims. No matter a person's argument, a study is usually always the biggest supporter. And a Wunderlynch's et al. Study focuses on the effects child beauty pageants have on their participants as they get older. It really isn't something I'd use to support an argument against them. However, it's viewed as a work that credibly highlights the cons of beauty pageants. Participants were 22 females selected from a larger sample of 560 female students. They each answered whether or not they participated in child beauty pageants as a child. Then the participants were questioned on their depression levels, anxiety, and how they saw themselves physically and their self-esteem. This study is lengthy and complex, but in the final few pages where the body image and mental health comparisons between those who did and those who did not participate in beauty pageants are discussed, the authors state that none of the results reached statistical significance. However, more importantly than what's stated at the very beginning of the study of the report, it states that a variety of biological, psychological, and environmental risk factors have been linked to disordered eating and negative body image. Who's allowed to pin such serious allegations as disordered eating and hindered mental health on child beauty pageants alone? It may be possible, but this carefully designed study against beauty pageants by A.L. Wunderlich can't credibly make that assumption. So here again, this person has some pretty good critical thinking in here. She brings in a study. He brings in a study that goes against what he's saying. He's supporting child beauty pageants. He brings a study in that's claiming child beauty pageants cause mental health issues and body image issues, disordered eating. And he refutes it really well with his critical thinking and looking closely between the lines of the study to sort of prove that it's wrong. So there's another good example. So there's some of the different ways that you can handle counter-arguments in your essay, and you always want to make sure you do handle counter-arguments in your essay. Also, you want to make sure when you're moving into your reasons that you do that after your counter-arguments. I think reasons usually work better afterwards. And when you're bringing your reasons in, you want to make sure you support them with evidence, but not all evidence is the same. Some evidence is stronger than other evidence. In a general rule, there's two types of evidence. The first one is primary. So primary evidence or primary sources is when you get your evidence directly from a source, like from an expert or from an author. So this will typically be from a journal. So if you read a journal article that presents a research study, and the research study is written by the people who conducted the study, then that's primary, because it's the people who actually obtained the information who are giving it to us. Those are your best sources, really, is where the experts are telling you what they found. Secondary evidence can work too, but it's typically not as strong. It's evidence that's reported secondhand. So if we read a newspaper article about a study that a researcher conducted, the newspaper article is written by a journalist. The journalist didn't conduct the research, so we're hearing about it secondhand, so it's secondary evidence. Not typically as strong, because secondary evidence usually doesn't take into factor all the concerns that a primary evidence would. So you can use secondary evidence, but just be careful with it. In addition to primary and secondary evidence, there are different types of evidence. Not all evidence is the same, right? Anecdotal evidence is evidence based on examples. So maybe you read an article and you find several examples that support what you're looking for. You could bring those examples in, and that's anecdotal evidence, like the one we just saw with the counter-argument with the example of the teacher who was fired. That's anecdotal evidence because it's evidence that's based on one example or based on several examples. As a general rule, these aren't that strong because you can think of a million examples a million different ways, so they don't really prove things that conclusively. Expert opinions are a little bit better. This is where an expert is giving his or her professional opinion based on years of practice and experience. So these are going to be much stronger because experts don't just sort of make things up, right? They have experience in the field, so they usually know what they're saying. So if somebody who's a doctor or an expert in a certain industry says something, it's a little bit stronger than just examples. And then research findings are probably your strongest pieces of evidence, or the results of analyses of data. This is where you get statistics and numbers, right? If you say like, 30% of kids are from single-parent families, that's the result of research that's been done, right? So any kind of numbers are usually the results of research or data analyses, and those are going to be your strongest pieces of evidence, depending on how they analyzed it and found their results, but that's usually pretty good. So let's take a quick look at some examples of some different ways of developing your reasons. So in this example right here, this person doesn't actually use any evidence. He just makes up a hypothetical example, and you'll see it's not very strong. This is from an article that is about fraternities, basically. And or no, sorry, this one's about underage drinking. And his thesis is something like the drinking age should be lowered to 18. And he says, there is also more to this problem than most people think, and a way of dealing with it could be psychological. For example, when a 5-year-old wants to get a bar of chocolate and his father doesn't allow him to do so, that only makes the child want the chocolate even more. In one way or another, be it through annoyance or stealing or any method of acquiring that chocolate bar to the point until the child gets what he wants. The same applies to alcohol. Teenagers, young adults will do anything in their power to get a 6-pack of beer or a bottle of vodka. The fact that someone of authority or a person says this is wrong, in turn, just motivates these underage people to create even more dynamic plans as to how they will acquire alcohol. So the more authorities and political figures push to enforce the drinking age, the more children will rebel and aim to get what they want. So here he's using logic, right? And he's coming up with his own logical, hypothetical example to prove his point, right? Which is that he's sort of comparing alcohol to chocolate and how basically psychologically people want what they can't have. So he kind of has a point. He is making a logical point, but we don't know that if that's true, right? There's no expert telling us that that's the case. It's just sort of him saying it, and we don't really know if he's an expert. So it's not really that strong. Even though he has a point, not a lot of good evidence there. Here's one that's a little bit better. It's based on a hypothetical, it's based on an example as well, but this one is actually an anecdotal. It's an example from the real world, something that happened that he read about like in a newspaper. He said, this one's about fraternities and why fraternities should be banned. So he says in here, aside from sexual assault and binge drinking, fraternities are responsible for endless accounts of drug abuse. In 2008, San Diego State suspended 6 fraternities for openly dealing drugs on campus. Drugs do nothing except corrupt society, and for members of various fraternities to be openly dealing in an environment built for learning and preparing for your future is unacceptable. In the article, 6 fraternities suspended in college drug probe, the probe prompted by the cocaine overdose death last year of a freshman sorority member led to the arrest of 96 people. Not only does the arrest of this many students bring shame to their own names, it brings shame along with a bad reputation for the university. Parents who have children that are applying to college do not want them attending an institution that has a record of drug raids and arrests. It is then continued on to state what was found in the raid. 2 kilograms of cocaine were seized in all, along with 350 ecstasy pills, marijuana, psychedelic mushrooms, hash oil, methamphetamine, illicit prescription drugs, several guns, and at least $60,000 in cash. And he forgot the year here for his source. Fraternity members are so concerned about having a good time that they disregard what's right and what's wrong. Drugs are responsible for corrupting the college campus along with the learning environment. Eliminating fraternities will reduce negative actions brought upon the universities. So here, he's giving an example, right? So of one fraternity where there were arrests, where there was several drugs, to make the point that fraternities have a lot of drugs. And it's true, in this one case they do, but this is only one case, right? There's probably several fraternities that don't have drug problems like this there. And this source is just kind of ignoring those ones. So that's one of the things that's not that strong about anecdotal evidence, is you can rarely draw a larger generalization based on just anecdotal evidence alone. This one combines expert opinion with anecdotal evidence, and I think it makes it just a little bit stronger. This one is arguing for life in prison as opposed to the death penalty, and the author says, first off, as was stated, life in prison is a more severe punishment for such a horrendous crime as murder. What is life in prison defined as? Deathpenaltyprocon.org specifies as a legal provision that states that the remainder of a criminal's natural life be spent in prison. There are hundreds of criminals who will tell anybody about the torment of prison life. On the outside, it may seem as though inmates are being coddled, as is described by one source. The reason for this is because prisoners do not have to be fed, clothed, or housed. However, the deeper reality is emotional and not physical, and it's the emotional aspects of prison life that inmates find enormously stressful. So here is a statement from experts. It's a good example of expert opinion. So these people know about the emotional turmoil of prison, and so they're qualified to tell us about it. The Death Penalty Information Center is cited by Johnson and McGonigal-Smith as well in its study on prison life. The quotation speaks for itself. So here's a research finding. One source of evidence on the extent of pain associated with life sentence is provided by condemned prisoners who tell us point blank that a life sentence is worse than a death sentence. These are not just empty words. A remarkable 123 prisoners, 11% of the 1,099 executions carried out at one prison in particular in 2008, dropped their appeals and allowed themselves to be killed. So here's an example of prisoners who actually don't like life in prison, dropping their appeals and allowing themselves to be murdered. So here's an example of a research finding, 11%. So we have an expert opinion and a research finding here, and then we have some anecdotal examples. One prisoner told researcher McGinnigal Smith about his view on dying compared to living the rest of one's life in prison. I think it takes more courage to go on. Dying is easy. It takes guts to keep plodding along. Johnson McGinnigal Smith. Another female rapper, Remy Martin, sentenced to 8 years in prison on May 13, 2008, due to alleged shooting, once wrote to her fans in a letter from jail reflecting on her prison experiences, "I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy." So there we have some anecdotal examples. So you have expert opinion, research finding, anecdotal examples, several things working to show us how difficult life in prison can be. And this is the last one. So this one is just based on research findings, but these are research findings that are reported in a secondary way. Although regulations have been made, so this is about pesticides, although regulations have been increasing over the years, one of the largest concerns is the effects of pesticides on expecting mothers' unborn children. 3 studies were done to observe the ramifications of these chemicals. The results of these studies were that children of mothers exposed to greater levels of pesticides had, on average, lower IQs than those of mothers not as greatly exposed to the same chemicals. One study conducted by Columbia University found that women in New York City with a higher exposure to pesticides had children with lower IQs. The more the women were exposed to the chemicals, the more the child suffers. For every large increase in pesticide exposure, the children had a 1 to 2 point decrease in IQ and a 2 to 4 point decrease in working memory. A study performed in Mexico yielded results that found that children demonstrated decreases in stamina, coordination, memory, and the ability to draw familiar objects when exposed frequently to pesticides. So here, these are the results of 2 studies, even though she mentions 3 here. But the issue is that since it's secondary, all we're getting is the actual results, but we don't really have a lot of explanation on the studies themselves. Not like the one that we just saw a bit ago with the child beauty pageants, where we got a lot of explanation of the way the study was done, how many participants there were. There's nothing like that here. So whenever we see research studies in secondary sources, you can use them, but they're usually not as strong as actually going to a primary source, right, and reading the actual results of the research study. That would make it much stronger. So those are just a couple of considerations when you're developing your body points. You want to make sure that you're, trying to find some primary sources. You can use secondary, but just be careful with them, and also make sure you keep in mind the different levels of evidence. As a result, study results are better than expert opinions, and expert opinions are better than anecdotal evidence. So let's flip back to the PowerPoint there. So that's reasons. So lastly, I want to talk just a little bit about developing your conclusions. So after you develop your reasons and your counter-arguments completely, you want to move into your conclusions in the essay. And remember that conclusion is a really good place to offer suggestions for the future. So now that you've made the reader believe your point, you want to tell him or her what to do next, right? So what steps should the reader take to resolve this issue? What should be done in the future? Are there organizations dedicated to solving this issue? Those are the kinds of things you want to think about in your conclusion. So let's take a look back at the examples of some conclusions. So here we have just 2 examples of 2 different conclusions. So you can see how these people use suggestions in their conclusions when they're developing their ideas. So this person starts here. In conclusion, there are many problems that exist with video games concerning the gender disparity today, such as the lack of females in the industry, the use of stereotypes to define male and female desires in inaccurate and harmful ways, and its potential to cause the same harm that TVs and movies have in the near future if nothing is changed. If these problems are ever fixed and women do indeed get more involved with video games, then there will be more presentations and opportunities for video games to grow as a valuable, remarkable form of media. She could have ended it here, but she also goes on to give the suggestions. There are a few things that can be done to help women get more involved with video games in the male-dominated industry and technology and media in general. So it's been suggested that libraries can play a part in offering girls to play with and creating games. Libraries are perfectly positioned to be inclusive, disregarding limits based on age, gender, or ethnicity, or what hobby one pursues. If you love games and gaming, then share that love and pride. And she cites a source, although she forgot the year. Public institutions such as libraries help all kinds of people achieve their dreams and aspirations, even though they will be minorities in the field they wish to pursue. There are many organizations that are dedicated to bringing women and girls together to get more involved in media and technology, and there should be more to help promote game design specifically to girls and women. So she could have listed some of these organizations, but pretty good. She has some good suggestions about libraries helping, some organizations that are good. So she takes it beyond, just summing up what she says and actually offers some suggestions. This one's really good, and it's a 3-paragraph conclusion about physician-assisted suicide, and it has a lot of good suggestions. She says, in conclusion, physician-assisted suicide should be legal in every state. PAS helps people who feared declining quality of life as well as a loss of independence. It allows patients to die with dignity, and there are guidelines in place to prevent abuse. People are allowed to make choices regarding every aspect of their life through their years, so they should be allowed to choose the circumstances in which they are to die if they are faced with a terminal illness. Physician-assisted suicide has already allowed many people to end their life on their own terms with dignity, but there are many people still out there who would like to take part in PAS but cannot because it's still illegal in their state. There are a few things you can do to help to spread awareness regarding PAS so that it can be legalized in more states, allowing people who wish to take part in it to do so. There are 2 large nonprofit organizations whose sole purpose is to help people have the best death possible. Compassionate Choices and Death with Dignity. The best ways to help these organizations would be to either donate or volunteer. You could also attend public hearings if your state is debating the issue and advocate to your family and friends and help educate them on the topic. Both organizations advocate for the cause and are responsible for most of the legislation pending in state governments. And then she kind of wraps it up here. If you're interested in introducing legislation on PAS in your state, you can contact either organization for legal help and advice. Each person in this country had to experience either themselves or a family member dealing with debilitating terminal illness. Maybe more people would understand, and laws in every state would already be passed. Since most people are fortunate to not have to deal with such things, it's important to get out there and advocate and explain to people what some are being forced to cope with, and let them know that PAS helps those end their lives with dignity. It's a really nice conclusion here because she has some good suggestions of the organizations and ways that they can help. So that's what you want to do in your conclusion is, how can we, help, or what can be done to help solve this issue. So let's move on. I want to just take a quick look at a full-length sample of this essay, just so you can see. So here's an example of a full-length sample. I just want to show you the format, right? So your essay should look something like this. This was actually written for this class. So here she has the author. You want my name, the date. You want a title. Hers was about pesticides. Pesticides kill more than mosquitoes. And she has her introduction. So her introduction starts with some definitions, and she cites sources. And she has the years when she's giving her definitions. She talks about some of the history of pesticides, and she cites a couple different sources here about the legality of pesticides, and about the history. So she looks at that history, and then she talks about pesticide spraying today and how many towns are involved in pesticide spraying projects, and she cites a couple sources in there. And her introduction ends here, right? The original intent of pesticides and the aerial application of them, and then she has her thesis down here. I agree with some of their reasons, but cannot believe it's worth risking other insects vital to our environment for the health of humans and future generations. And from there, she moves into some counter-arguments. Many people favor the use of pesticides, and she talks about some people who support it. And then she moves into her reasons, and she says, despite the benefits, there are many concerns. And here she cites, some experts that talk about how pesticides can harm bees. And then she talks about how pesticides have created autism, and she cites some sources for that. And then she talks about how pesticides have harmed wild animals, and she cites some sources on that too. And then in here, she talks about how pesticides probably aren't safe for being sprayed in communities. Then she moves into her suggestions. She cannot agree with pesticides, and then she says what needs to be done. We need to get the EPA on board banning pesticides more. And then she has her reference page. These are all her references. You can revisit that lesson on APA style if you forgot how to create references or use citation machine, but you want to create a reference for each source you use and then put them in alphabetical order and make sure to use this hanging indent here. So that's what a final paper should look like. So let's move here and wrap up this lesson. So we covered quite a bit in here, and I think when developing an essay, you want to make sure that you include counterarguments and reasons. You want to make sure you handle your counterarguments by either accepting them or refuting them, and also be sure to develop your reasons with the best evidence and use sources when you're developing your reasons. And keep in mind that not all evidence is equal. Finally, you want to make sure that you make recommendations in your conclusions. So keep that in mind. Keep working on the paper. Your final paper should be about 4 to 5 pages and have at least 5 sources in APA style. Email me if you have any questions or run into any trouble, but try to get that first draft done and email it to me as soon as possible. And that's the end of this lesson, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.